The road was long and winding, surrounded by thick trees on both sides that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. The air smelled fresh and damp, a mix of pine and wet earth, a smell that always meant we were getting close to the kind of place we were after. My partner and I had driven for hours, the kind of drive where the miles blur together and all you can focus on is the sound of the engine and the dull ache in your legs from sitting too long. We were both exhausted but excited. This cabin rental was supposed to be our little escape from everything. Work, noise, people. Just us and the woods. When we finally pulled into the narrow dirt driveway, the tires crunching over loose gravel and scattered leaves, I felt a flicker of relief. The cabin sat at the end of the path, tucked back among tall trees with thick trunks and rough bark. It looked old but sturdy, made of weathered logs and a metal roof that had lost some of its shine. The porch was simple, with a rough wooden bench pushed to one side and a small stack of firewood piled near the steps. I noticed right away that there was no sign of anyone around, which was exactly what we wanted. But something caught my eye that made me pause. Sitting neatly side by side on the porch just next to the door was a pair of muddy boots. They were tall, heavy-duty work boots, caked with dirt and mud that looked fresh, like someone had been walking in wet soil not long ago. I stepped closer, curious. They weren't my style, but I knew my partner would recognize them. They were similar to the kind of boots our neighbor used back home for his farm. I looked around quickly, expecting to see someone nearby. Maybe the person who owned the boots was still around, or maybe the previous guests had left them behind. But the driveway was empty. No car, no signs of recent activity besides the boots. I called out softly, "Hello?" But there was no answer. The woods swallowed my voice, leaving only the quiet rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. My partner joined me on the porch, and after a brief glance at the boots, he shrugged. "Probably the last renters left them," he said. "They forgot to take them or something." I wanted to believe him. It made sense after all. We weren't the first to rent this cabin, and if someone had been hiking or working nearby, muddy boots wouldn't be unusual. Still, a small part of me felt uneasy. It was the kind of feeling that settles deep in your chest when something doesn't quite add up, but you try to ignore it. We went inside and started unpacking. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and something faintly sour, maybe old fabric or dampness. The windows were small and thick with dust, but the place was clean. The furniture was basic: a worn couch, a wooden table with a few mismatched chairs, and a small kitchen with a rusty stove. There was a bedroom with a single bed and a closet with creaky doors. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy enough. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. We lit a small fire in the stove and sat close to it, trying to shake off the chill. The woods outside grew darker, the trees casting long shadows in the firelight that flickered through the cabin windows. We ate some cold sandwiches and drank water from the bottle we'd brought. Then the sound started. At first, it was faint, soft footsteps, like someone walking slowly on dry leaves or twigs just outside. I froze when I heard it, looking toward the window. My partner heard it too and paused mid-bite. The footsteps stopped, and the woods were silent again, except for the crackling fire. We tried to ignore it, telling ourselves it was probably an animal or the wind moving branches around. But every now and then, the footsteps came back, slower this time, almost like someone was pacing the porch or walking near the cabin in circles. I checked the door locks. Everything was tight and secure. The windows were shut, and there was no way in without making noise. I wanted to say something, but my voice caught in my throat. I felt a mix of nervousness and anger. Angry that someone could be so careless as to walk around outside a rented cabin late at night, possibly disturbing us or maybe worse, watching. But when I looked out again, there was nothing. No shadow, no shape, just the dark outline of trees swaying in the night breeze. We went to bed with the curtains drawn tight and the door locked. I lay awake, listening to the silence and the faint creaks of the old cabin settling. The footsteps didn't come back that night, but the memory of them kept me tense. My partner finally fell asleep, but I stared at the ceiling, wondering who those boots belonged to and why someone would be outside in the dark when the place was supposed to be empty. The next morning, the sun broke through the trees, casting golden light over everything. I got up first and stepped onto the porch to get some fresh air. The boots were gone. Just like that. I looked around carefully, half expecting to see someone hiding behind a tree or a bush, but there was no one. The dirt on the porch was dry now, and there were no fresh tracks or signs that anyone had been there recently. I told my partner, and he seemed just as puzzled. We had both been certain the boots were there the night before. We searched around the cabin, but there was no sign of footprints or anything else out of place. It was like the boots had vanished into thin air. Later that day, I called the cabin owner. I wanted to check if anyone else was supposed to be staying there or if the boots might have been left by the maintenance people. The owner sounded surprised. She said no one had been there for weeks, not since the last renters left, and the cleaning crew only came once a month. She assured me no one else had been around recently. That answer didn't settle the growing knot in my stomach. If no one else had been there, then who had those boots belonged to? And why had they disappeared so suddenly? We decided to stay the rest of our trip, but I kept my phone close and checked every noise outside. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. The woods seemed different, somehow quieter but heavier. At night, the shadows felt deeper, and the breeze seemed to carry a faint echo of footsteps that never led anywhere. By the time we left, I was relieved to be back in the car, driving away from the cabin and its mysteries. I never saw the boots again, and I never found out who had left them on the porch that first night. But the memory of those muddy boots, sitting there alone in the quiet woods, has stayed with me. It's the kind of thing you try to explain away, but sometimes no explanation feels quite right. Sometimes things just don't make sense, and maybe in the middle of nowhere, that's the scariest feeling of all. The couple had been looking forward to this weekend getaway for months. After weeks of planning, they finally found a small cabin deep in the woods, far enough from the noise of the city to relax and forget about work. The pictures online showed a cozy little house with a stone chimney, big windows, and a warm, wooden interior that looked inviting. The reviews from past renters seemed fine, nothing out of the ordinary. It was perfect, or so they thought. The drive to the cabin was long but peaceful. The narrow dirt road wound through tall trees, their leaves whispering in the light breeze. By the time they pulled up to the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the hills, casting a golden glow on the wooden walls. The air smelled fresh, with hints of pine and damp earth. They unloaded the car and stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the old wood floors under their feet. The living room was simple but comfortable. There was a worn leather couch, a small wood stove in the corner, and a low bookshelf filled with old novels and some board games. The kitchen was small but functional, with a stove, a fridge, and a basic set of dishes. They unpacked, lit a fire, and settled in with some wine and snacks. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but in a way that felt peaceful. That night, as they were getting ready for bed, the man noticed a heavy door in the corner of the living room. It was old, made of thick, dark wood with rusty metal hinges, the kind of door you might find in a cellar or a basement of an old house. It was locked tight, and there was no key anywhere nearby. The woman hadn't noticed it before. They tried to see if there was a way to open it, but it didn't budge. The next morning, the man called the owner of the cabin, a man who sounded friendly enough on the phone. He said it was just a storage closet, nothing to worry about, and the lock was probably there to keep the owner's tools and old things safe. He shrugged off their questions and didn't seem interested in talking much about it. They decided not to push it. During the day, they explored the area around the cabin. The woods were thick, with tall pines and ferns covering the forest floor. They walked along a narrow trail that led to a small creek, where the water was clear and cold. Birds sang high in the branches, and the occasional squirrel darted across their path. The quiet felt good, and they both relaxed more than they had in weeks. That evening, back inside the cabin, they ate dinner and sat by the fire. The woman noticed the door again but didn't mention it. Instead, she tried to enjoy the moment, feeling the warmth from the flames and the soft crackling sound. As the night grew darker, they got ready for bed. Around midnight, the man was awakened by a strange noise. At first, it was so faint he thought it might have been in his dream. But then it came again. Soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, on the wooden floor near the living room. Then low whispers, like someone talking quietly but not clearly enough to understand. He nudged the woman awake, and they both listened. The noise seemed to come from behind that heavy door. They sat up, eyes wide in the dark. The door didn't move, but the sounds persisted for a few more minutes before fading away. Neither of them wanted to check the door at that moment. It felt wrong, almost like breaking some rule. The woman held the man's hand tightly, and after a while, they managed to fall back asleep, but neither could shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, they debated what to do. They decided to call the owner again, this time asking more directly about the door and the noises. When they explained what they heard, the owner's tone changed completely. His voice became sharp and defensive, almost angry. He told them firmly never to open that door under any circumstances and that it was for their own safety. When pressed, he refused to explain further and ended the call abruptly. The couple was uneasy after that. They didn't feel welcome, and the owner's attitude made them more suspicious. Still, they wanted to believe it was nothing serious. They decided to leave the door alone, but the mystery kept nagging at them. That day, they packed their things slowly. The woman noticed some scratches on the floorboards near the door, which hadn't been there before. The man found a faint, musty smell coming from the cracks around the door frame. It smelled like damp wood mixed with something else. Something metallic, cold. They tried to ignore it, but the feeling of discomfort grew. Before leaving, the man checked online for any reviews or mentions of the cabin. To their surprise, they found a few posts on local forums from previous renters. The reports were vague but chilling. People had talked about missing belongings, strange banging sounds late at night, and a heavy door in the cabin that no one was allowed to open. Some mentioned feeling watched or hearing footsteps when no one else was there. One review described loud thumping and banging noises coming from behind the door, sometimes lasting for hours. Another said they woke up to find some of their things moved or missing, but nothing was ever stolen outright. Instead, it was as if something was going through their stuff when they were asleep or out. They realized they weren't the first to experience something strange. The owner's warning suddenly made sense, but it didn't ease their worry. When they left the cabin, the woods seemed darker somehow, as if the shadows themselves had shifted. The man looked back once more before getting in the car, his eyes lingering on the locked door they had never opened. They promised each other never to return. The next day, the man called the local ranger station to ask if anyone had ever reported anything unusual at the cabin. The ranger told him the cabin had a history. Years ago, it belonged to a man who kept dangerous animals in a hidden basement room. The door led to a deep cellar where the man kept old equipment and cages for trapping wild animals he claimed were a threat to the forest. The animals were removed after an inspection, but locals still believed strange noises came from the cabin late at night. The heavy door wasn't just a storage closet. It was the entrance to that hidden basement, locked to keep people out. The banging and whispers were probably caused by rats, raccoons, or some other wildlife trapped behind the door, trying to get out or just making noise inside the dark space. The couple realized that the noises weren't supernatural but very real, and very dangerous. The owner's defensive attitude now seemed like fear of what might still be behind that door. They felt lucky they had left when they did. The cabin was a peaceful place on the surface, but that locked door hid something wild and uncontrollable, something better left alone. From then on, the couple avoided cabins with locked rooms or unexplained doors. The experience taught them to trust their instincts and never ignore what feels off, no matter how cozy or inviting a place seems. They still talk about that weekend, the quiet woods, the heavy door, and the low, haunting sounds that chased them away. It was a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you never see, just hear and feel waiting in the dark. It was early October when a group of us decided to rent an old log cabin tucked away in the woods for the weekend. We wanted a break from the city, a chance to get away from noise, screens, and the usual chaos. I was with 3 close friends, Mark, Lisa, and Dave, and we found the cabin listed on a small rental site. It was advertised as rustic and remote, somewhere you could truly disconnect. The photos showed a squat wooden building with thick logs darkened by age, a stone chimney, and a porch cluttered with weathered rocking chairs. The setting was perfect. Deep woods surrounded by towering pines, the kind of place where the nearest neighbor was miles away. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the sky a dull orange fading into purple. The road in was a dirt track, rutted and narrow, the tires crunching over fallen leaves and loose gravel. Pulling up to the cabin, the place looked even older and more worn than the picture suggested. The logs were cracked and gray, with moss creeping between some of them. The porch had a sag to it, and the wooden steps creaked under our feet. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust, with smoke, and something faintly sour, like old damp clothes left too long in a closet. The floorboards were uneven, with some spots that moaned under weight. There was a small fireplace with a rusty grate, a couple of folding chairs, a wooden table scratched up and stained from years of use. The windows were grimy and streaked, filtering the outside light in dull patches. Despite the cabin's state, it had a charm to it. We laughed and joked as we unpacked, lighting a fire in the hearth to warm the place. The air inside was cool but dry. Outside, the trees were already thickening with shadows, their branches scratching softly against the roof with the night wind. The first night was mostly quiet. We sat around the fire, drinking beer and talking about work, relationships, and the usual stuff. When we finally turned in, the house settled with its usual creaks and groans. At one point, I thought I heard faint voices coming through the walls, like low talking, but I shrugged it off as the wind or maybe the pipes. The others hadn't noticed, or at least didn't say anything. The next day we spent hiking the trails nearby, walking among the trees, enjoying the crisp air. The woods felt alive in a different way, quieter, thicker, somehow heavier than any forest I'd been in before. We kept the cabin door locked when we left and made sure the fire was out before heading out. Back at the cabin, the sun filtering through the grimy windows made the dust particles hang in the air like tiny ghosts. The place had this old, almost forgotten feel to it, like it was holding on to memories no one talked about. That night, as we settled into bed, the voices returned. This time, they were clearer, like 2 people arguing quietly. I could hear raised tones, but no words I could understand, just the anger and frustration in their voices. I nudged Lisa, but she was already half asleep and told me it was nothing, just the house settling or animals in the walls. Dave said the same. Mark made a joke about ghosts and we all laughed it off, but the feeling in the air had shifted. The voices felt too close to ignore. When morning came, I was the first awake. The cabin was cold, colder than the night before. The fire had long died out, and the wooden floor was stiff under my bare feet. The air smelled faintly sour again, and I could still hear the faintest echo of voices behind the walls. I told myself it was just the wood expanding and contracting with the temperature, but the sound was too specific, too human. That day, we explored more of the surrounding woods, and I kept thinking about those voices. We talked about it briefly, but none of us wanted to admit how strange it really felt. It was easier to joke about it, to act like the noises were just in our heads. Back at the cabin, as the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped rapidly. We made dinner over the small propane stove, the dull click of the burner the only sound besides the wind outside. Mark was the last to go to bed, and before turning off the lights, he pressed his ear against one of the logs near the fireplace. "Guys," he whispered, "I think I just heard my name." We all froze. It was impossible. No one outside the 4 of us knew we were here, and yet Mark swore he heard a soft whisper right through the wood. His own name, clear and slow. We didn't say much after that. The cabin felt like it was closing in on us, the walls seeming thicker and heavier, as if they were alive with secrets we couldn't understand. None of us slept well. Every little noise felt amplified, the wind scratching at the windows, the creak of the porch boards, the soft murmur behind the logs. The next morning, we packed up quickly. None of us wanted to admit it, but the cabin had an oppressive weight to it now. On our way out, We stopped by the small visitor center at the edge of the property to ask about the history of the cabin. The woman who owned the cabin was a middle-aged local with weathered skin and sharp eyes. She told us the cabin was built over the remains of an old homestead, settled back in the early 1900s. A family had lived there, mother, father, and 2 children. One day, decades ago, they vanished without a trace. No signs of a struggle, no clues left behind, just gone. Since then, the land had passed through different owners, and the cabin was eventually built on the site. Over the years, people had reported strange noises, whispers, arguments, footsteps, but no one stayed long enough to find out why. Hearing that, everything we experienced suddenly made sense in a way. The voices, the whispers, the feelings of being watched, all tied to something buried deep in the old walls and the ground beneath them. The woman said she didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. She thought the sounds were probably caused by the cabin's old construction, the wood shifting and settling in the cold nights, or animals living in the walls and under the floorboards. But the story stuck with me as we drove away. That night, I lay awake thinking about those people who disappeared, trapped somehow in the silence of those woods. The cabin had been built on their home, and maybe the voices we heard weren't ghosts but echoes. Memories buried in the wood and stone, playing out over and over in the dark. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that the cabin holds onto its past, that the walls still remember the family who lived and vanished there, and that those faint arguments we heard were the last moments of a life long gone but never forgotten. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The idea was simple: get away from the noise and distractions of everyday life, rent a small cabin in the woods, and finally get some serious writing done. I'm a writer, but sometimes the constant buzz of the city, the endless notifications, and the clutter of daily life make it nearly impossible to focus. So, when I found a tiny cabin a couple of hours away from town, surrounded by nothing but dense trees and quiet, I jumped on it without hesitation. The cabin was basic, no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, just the bare essentials. It was a one-room setup with a small kitchenette, a wood stove, and a bed pushed up against the wall. Outside, there was a small porch with a couple of wooden chairs, perfect for morning coffee or late-night star watching. The rental website said it was peaceful, isolated, and perfect for creative solitude. I believed it. The first day was exactly what I needed. I unpacked my laptop, notebooks, and some snacks, then spent the afternoon writing with the window cracked open, letting in the fresh, pine-scented air. The sun was warm, the birds sang, and I felt that rare, delicious peace you only get when you truly step away from everything. That night, I went to bed early, tired from the drive and the day's work. The cabin was pitch dark except for the soft glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. I remember the sound of crickets outside and the occasional snap of twigs in the distance. It was the kind of silence that's almost too quiet, where every tiny sound becomes loud. I was asleep sometime before midnight. Then, suddenly, I was jerked awake by the slow creaking of the bedroom door opening. It wasn't a slam or a quick crack. It was slow, deliberate, and chilling. The door moved an inch, then paused, then another inch. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat up fast, eyes wide, staring at the door. But when I looked, no one was there. The room was empty. The door stood ajar, swinging slightly in the still air. I shook my head, thinking it must have been the wind. The cabin was old, after all. Maybe the door wasn't fully latched, and a gust had pushed it open. I got up, closed the door firmly, locked it with the small bolt, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easy after that. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside made me jumpy. The next day, I tried to push the experience out of my mind. I told myself I was imagining things, that the cabin was just old and creaky, and that I needed to focus on my writing. The day passed without incident. I even laughed to myself, thinking how silly I was to be scared of a door. But when the second night rolled around, it happened again. Around midnight, I woke up to the same slow creak, the bedroom door moving open, just like the night before. My heart jumped. I sat up again, staring at the door. It moved the same way, inch by inch, as if someone was easing it open. But again, there was no one there. I stayed awake for a long time after that, listening and watching. The door never closed, just stayed open a crack in the dark room. I eventually fell asleep with a lamp on and the door locked again, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I spent a restless night, waking several times, listening to the sounds outside. The third day, I decided I wasn't going to let this keep me from writing, but I couldn't ignore it either. I went into town and bought a small security camera. Nothing fancy, just a simple one that recorded to a memory card. I set it up in my bedroom, pointing it directly at the door. That night, I went to bed early, locking the door firmly. I tried to convince myself that I'd catch nothing unusual and that the whole thing was just my imagination. But when I woke up the next morning, my stomach tightened as I grabbed the camera. I plugged it into my laptop and hit play. The footage was in grainy black and white because of the low light, but it was clear enough to see the bedroom and the door. The timestamp showed it was just after midnight. The door started to move, just like I'd heard. The slow, inch-by-inch creak as it opened. Then, a shadowy figure slipped through the doorway. The figure was tall, thin, and moved silently. It didn't look around or make a sound. It stood in the room for almost a full minute, completely still. Then it turned and left, closing the door behind it. I watched the clip again and again. There was no mistaking it. Someone had come into my room while I was asleep. I felt frozen, my hands shaking. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was right there. The figure was too vague to see any clear features, but the shape was unmistakably human. The rest of that day, I packed my things. I kept replaying the video in my mind and thinking about all the things that could have happened if the figure had moved closer, or if I had been asleep when it came in. I felt unsafe in a place that had seemed so perfect just days before. Before I left, I looked around the cabin carefully. The windows were all locked, but the main door was old and creaked loudly when it moved. I realized I must have left it unlocked or at least not fully latched the first night. Whoever or whatever had come in had to have gotten through that door. I drove away slowly, not daring to look back. I didn't sleep well that night. My mind kept replaying the image of that shadow, standing silently in my room, watching without moving. I never went back to that cabin, and I haven't rented a place alone in the woods since. The thought that someone could have been there, slipping in and out of my room without a sound or a trace, left me shaken. It wasn't ghosts or spirits. It was real. Someone had entered my space when I was vulnerable, and it reminded me how easily safety can be an illusion. I still don't know who it was or why they came, but I learned that some quiet places hold more danger than you'd expect. I rented the cabin for a week, thinking it would be the perfect escape from city noise and the constant buzz of everyday life. The place was tucked away near a small lake, far enough from the main road that it took a good 30 minutes driving on gravel and dirt just to get there. The air was crisp, the kind that smelled of pine and fresh earth, and the whole area seemed quiet and untouched. The cabin itself was modest, one room with a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a couple of beds. Nothing fancy, but it looked cozy in the photos online. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked my bag, stacked some firewood outside, and walked down to the lake. The water was still, reflecting the sky and the thick trees lining the shore. A few birds called here and there, but other than that, the silence was almost total. I spent the afternoon reading and cooking a simple meal on the stove. I had no cell service out there, which was exactly why I wanted to come. No calls, no messages, no distractions. As night fell, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the last light fade from the sky. The woods around the cabin looked dark and thick, the tall pines casting long shadows in the moonlight. I felt a calm settle over me, like I was far removed from the rest of the world. That feeling didn't last long. Around 10 p.m., I noticed a small flicker of light deep in the woods. At first, I thought it might be a firefly or something natural, but the light wasn't blinking or moving erratically like insects do. It was steady and bright, like a flashlight. I strained my eyes and saw it moving slowly through the trees, heading toward the cabin. I blinked, thinking I might be imagining it, but the light kept coming, moving through the dark woods. I grabbed my jacket and went outside to get a better look, stepping quietly onto the porch. The light moved cautiously, not rushing, just inching through the trees. For a moment, I thought it might be someone lost or maybe a local hunter. I didn't hear any voices or calls, just the soft crackle of dry branches underfoot. The light stopped at the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood and then faded into the shadows. I stayed out there a while longer, watching. After a few minutes, the woods went completely dark again. I went back inside and locked the doors. I felt a little uneasy, but I told myself it was nothing, just someone passing by, or maybe a hunter checking the area. The next day was uneventful. I went for a long hike around the lake, collecting some wildflowers and taking pictures of the old trees. I even saw a deer drinking from the water at dawn. During the afternoon, I saw no one and heard no sounds except the wind through the leaves. But as soon as the sun went down, the strange lights appeared again. Each night, around the same time, I could see the faint glow of a flashlight moving through the trees. Sometimes it came closer to the cabin, other times it stayed far back near the water. One night, I sat on the porch for a long time, waiting to see what would happen. The light came slowly through the trees, steady and quiet. I could make out a figure this time, an old man standing just beyond the tree line. He didn't move or speak, just stood there, watching the cabin without blinking. His clothes looked worn, like something an old farmer or woodsman would wear. A faded jacket, a hat pulled low over his forehead. His face was hard to see in the dim light, but I could tell he wasn't smiling. The way he looked at the cabin was intense, almost like he was guarding it or waiting for something. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. I just watched him watch me. After what felt like an hour, he turned and disappeared into the woods without a sound. That night, I barely slept. The image of the old man's silent, steady gaze stuck in my mind. I kept thinking about who he was and why he was watching the cabin every night. My first instinct was to leave, but I reminded myself I had already paid for the week, and I didn't want to run from something that might be harmless. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Every night, around 10 p.m., the light appeared, and the old man stood beyond the trees, always watching. I tried to catch a better look during the day, but never saw him. The area around the cabin was empty. No footprints, no signs of anyone living nearby. On the fourth night, I noticed something different. The old man was closer than usual, just a few yards past the tree line. I could hear the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl, but he made no sound. His posture was stiff, like he was waiting for something to happen. I kept my distance and stayed inside, watching him through the window. He didn't move for over an hour, then slowly turned and vanished into the dark woods again. After that night, I started searching online for information about the cabin and the area. I found a few old reviews from previous renters, some mentioning the strange man. They called him a hermit who lived nearby, someone who didn't speak or approach visitors but just watched silently for days. No one seemed to know much more about him, just that he was always there, a quiet presence in the woods. Some people said he was harmless, just a loner who wanted to keep an eye on his land. Others felt uneasy, like he was more than just a man wandering the forest. I wondered if the cabin was on his property or close to it. Maybe he thought I was a threat, or maybe he was just curious. On my last night, I sat outside by the fire pit, the flames flickering and throwing shadows on the trees. The old man appeared again, his figure barely visible in the moonlight. This time, I didn't look away or hide. He stood there silently, watching the fire and me. I didn't feel fear anymore, just a strange sense of respect for his quiet presence. I thought about how lonely he must be, living out here with no one but the forest. When the fire died down, I went inside, packed my things quietly, and left before dawn. Driving away from the cabin, I glanced back at the tree line, half expecting to see the old man still standing there, watching. But he was gone. Later, after I returned home, I reached out to the rental company. They confirmed the stories I'd found online about the hermit. They said he was an old man who'd lived there for decades, never bothering anyone but always watching visitors. They advised me not to get too close or try to talk to him. He wasn't dangerous, just very private. Looking back, I realized how strange the whole experience was. How a simple cabin rental turned into a silent watch with someone who seemed to belong to the woods themselves. It wasn't a ghost story or a horror tale. It was just a man and his land, watching in quiet solitude. I don't think I'll rent that cabin again, but I'll never forget the nights when the woods came alive with that slow-moving light and the old man who stood just beyond the trees, silently watching. We thought renting a cabin in the woods would be a great way to get away from the city noise and the constant pressure of work and school. My wife, our 2 daughters, and I packed the car and drove about 3 hours out to a remote area that promised quiet, nature, and a break from screens and calls. The place looked great in the pictures the owner had sent. It was a small wooden cabin set in a clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. The owner said it was peaceful, off the grid enough to unplug, but still with some basic amenities. We imagined long hikes, campfires, and board games by the fireplace. The drive was smooth, winding through narrow roads flanked by dense forest. The closer we got, the more isolated the surroundings became. I remember the air smelled fresher, cooler, and the light seemed softer, filtered through the tree canopy. We pulled up to the cabin just before sunset, the sky a mix of orange and purple. The cabin was older but sturdy, with a small porch, a woodpile neatly stacked by the side, and windows glowing with warm light inside. It had a rustic charm, and the girls were immediately excited. We unpacked, lit a fire in the stone hearth, and prepared dinner. The girls ran outside to chase fireflies while my wife and I set up the table. After we ate, we settled in to relax. I tried to check my phone for signal and noticed only one bar, barely enough to load anything. My wife's phone was worse, no service at all. The younger one, Emma, had a different carrier and somehow got a tiny bit of signal, maybe 1 or 2 bars, but no real connection. We told the girls to enjoy the moment, that this was our chance to unplug. No work emails, no social media, no calls. That first night, the silence was almost too much. The forest sounds were everywhere. The crackling fire, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, but no human voices, no cars. The cabin creaked as the wood settled and the wind pushed against the windows. Felt good in a way, calming. I lay awake for a while listening to the quiet. We had all agreed to leave our phones off the first night to enjoy the unplugged experience. The next day, we explored the area. There was a small trail that led into the woods, not marked but clearly walked often enough. The girls found a shallow stream where they skipped stones and tried to catch tadpoles with their hands. My wife and I talked about how nice it was to be away, how much the girls needed this break. We didn't see another person or house for hours. I tried calling the owner to ask about the landline in case of emergency, but the call didn't go through. Back at the cabin, I noticed a dusty old landline phone on a small table near the kitchen. It looked unused, the cord tangled and faded yellow. I picked it up and listened. There was no dial tone. I mentioned it to the owner when she stopped by the next afternoon to drop off firewood and check if we needed anything. She was a woman in her 60s, with a friendly but tired smile. "That phone's been dead for months," she said, her voice low. "No one's fixed the line because there's no real need anymore. No neighbors close by, and most people use their cell phones. But out here, cell service is patchy at best. You'll be lucky to get a bar." I nodded, feeling a little uneasy but thankful for the warning. She told us there were no other cabins within several miles and that the closest town was at least an hour's drive back the way we came. She promised to check on us again before the weekend ended and left with a wave. That evening, after dinner, the girls were playing a board game by the fire while my wife and I cleaned up. Emma's phone, which had been mostly silent all day, suddenly rang. It was a strange sound, a harsh, ragged breathing, coming through the speaker. There was no caller ID, just a blank screen. Emma jumped, dropping the phone on the floor with a surprised yelp. The room went quiet. I picked up the phone and stared at the screen, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I answered it, half expecting silence or a prank, but there was only silence. No voice, no background noise, just a heavy, oppressive quiet. I tried to hold the phone steady, listening. Then the breathing started again. Rough, ragged, close. I told Emma to bring me the cabin phone. I wanted to see if maybe the landline could give us any clue or connection. She fetched the old phone and I tried dialing my own cell. Nothing. No tone, no connection. I listened carefully and realized there was no dial tone either. It was as dead as the day the owner had said. I tested the line a few more times just to be sure, but it was useless. The girls were now nervous, sitting closer to my wife. I reassured them as best I could that it was probably just some glitch or a wrong number, maybe some prank from cell towers out of range. Still, I felt an odd cold sinking in my chest. Something about that breath on the phone had been wrong, too deliberate, too heavy to be random. That night, I double-checked the locks and peered out the windows. The forest was dark and still. I thought I saw a shadow move behind the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. The girls slept fitfully, and I stayed awake a while longer, listening to every crack and snap. The next day passed slowly. We kept close to the cabin, making sure the girls didn't wander too far. The cell service remained spotty. I could barely send a text to work to say I might be out of contact for the next few days. When the owner returned to pick us up, I asked her again about the phone and the strange call. She looked at me for a long moment before admitting the phone line had been dead for months. She said she hadn't mentioned it earlier because no one usually tried to use it. Also, she warned us that no one else lived close by. No neighbors, no passing hikers, nothing. She looked serious then, her usual friendly smile gone. "You're really far out here. If you need help, you have to drive into town. There's no emergency service coming this way fast." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The silence around the cabin, the dead phone, the strange call. It all added up to one thing. Out here, we were on our own. No instant help, no quick rescue. We packed up the next morning with an extra sense of urgency. The girls were quiet, clinging a little more to my wife's side as we loaded the car. The woods seemed darker somehow, less inviting. The road back was long, and the cell signals slowly came back as we drove, the city noises creeping back in. I kept the phone call in my mind, the ragged breathing that came out of nowhere. Whatever it was a warning, a reminder that even in the quietest, most peaceful places, you're never truly out of reach of something you can't control. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what you see or hear, but the silence that follows. I spent the better part of a year planning my solo trip to a remote cabin deep in the woods. It wasn't some fancy vacation. I just wanted a break from the noise and chaos of the city. The cabin belonged to a friend who hadn't used it in years, and they agreed to let me stay there alone for a week. It was nestled in the middle of a dense forest, miles from the nearest road, without cell service or power. I told myself this was going to be a good chance to disconnect and get back to basics. No screens, no internet, just me and nature. The trip started well enough. I loaded my old Jeep with everything I thought I'd need. Canned food, fresh water, a first aid kit, a lantern, firewood, and a heavy blanket. The last few miles on the dirt road shook the car badly, and the cabin looked more worn than I remembered, but it was solid. Built in the 70s, it had wooden walls thick with age, a small stone fireplace, and a handful of creaky chairs. The windows were grimy, letting in only thin streams of light, but the air smelled clean and sharp like pine needles and earth. I set my things down on the cracked wooden floor, lit the fireplace, and made a simple dinner of canned beans heated on the old stove. The silence was overwhelming at first. No cars, no people, just the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. I sat by the fire, sipping a cup of black coffee, feeling a mix of peace and a tiny bit of unease. Out here, there was nothing to hide behind or escape to. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction. The first night passed without incident, though I was careful to lock the door and windows before crawling into the sleeping bag. The wind picked up outside, rattling the thin glass panes, and the chimney creaked with the draft. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing but swaying branches and a patch of moonlight on the ground. I told myself it was probably an animal or the wind playing tricks. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. I had a map but quickly realized the trees all looked the same and the trails weren't marked. After a couple of hours of walking, I found a small stream and followed it, knowing water usually leads somewhere. The air was thick with the smell of damp moss and decaying leaves, and my boots sank slightly with every step. Occasionally, I'd see a deer or hear the distant caw of a crow. Despite the beauty, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a prickly awareness. Something in the quiet was too quiet, and the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon chopping more firewood and stacking it neatly by the door. I wanted to make sure I was prepared for the cold nights. As the sun started to dip behind the trees, the temperature dropped fast, and I built the fire early. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the crackling noise was comforting. I ate a simple meal, double-checked my supplies, and settled down with a book. But then the noises started. At first, it was a soft scratching on the outside of the cabin, like nails tapping against wood. I froze, listening. The scratching came again, this time near the back door. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it on the outside wall, but there was nothing there. The forest was dark and thick, and I couldn't see more than a few feet past the cabin. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a bird, but my skin was tight and my heart was racing. Later that night, I heard it again, but closer, almost like something was trying to pry the door open. I wasn't about to find out, so I grabbed the small hatchet I brought and stayed wide awake by the fire. I listened to the sounds of twigs snapping, leaves crunching just outside the window. They didn't sound like any animal I knew. They were deliberate and heavy, like a person walking carefully through the brush. The next morning, I found fresh footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were large, like a man's, and there was only one set. The prints led into the woods and then disappeared near a fallen tree. That was when I felt something shift inside me. Up to that point, I thought I was prepared for solitude and wildlife, but now I wondered if someone else was out there, watching or following me. I stayed inside for most of the day after that. The feeling of being watched never left, and every noise made me jump. I kept the fire going, and every now and then, I peeked out a window. The forest was eerily still, like it was holding its breath again. No birds, no animals, no wind, just silence. That night, the noises got worse. Started around midnight. The scratching on the door returned, louder and more frantic. Then came the heavy thumping against the walls, like someone was pounding their fists or trying to break in. I grabbed my flashlight and hatchet again and moved to the window, shining the light into the darkness. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the moonlight. He wasn't moving, just watching the cabin. His clothes were dark and torn, and his face was hidden by shadows. I didn't recognize him, and I had no idea how long he had been there. I didn't dare open the door or shout. I just stood frozen, holding my breath. The man disappeared as suddenly as he had come. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, the hatchet in my hand, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning finally came, I packed up what I could and prepared to leave. But then I realized the Jeep wouldn't start. The battery was dead. I had no cell phone signal to call for help. The dirt road back to the main highway was at least a mile through the dense forest, and I was alone, with no way to defend myself if that man returned. I decided I had to walk. I packed a small bag with food, water, the hatchet, and the lighter, then locked the cabin door as best as I could and started down the road. The forest was thick and dark, and I moved as fast as I could without making noise. Every rustle and snap of a twig made me glance over my shoulder, but the man didn't appear again. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the main road. I was exhausted and covered in sweat and dirt. I stuck out my thumb, hoping a car would come along. After nearly an hour, a pickup truck slowed and pulled over. The driver was a middle-aged man with tired eyes but a kind face. I told him my story quickly, and he agreed to drive me back to town. Later, when I reported the incident to the local sheriff, they told me the area was known for a handful of homeless people who sometimes camped in the woods, but they had never had complaints of violence or break-ins before. The sheriff promised to check on the cabin and keep an eye on the area. I never went back. Even now, months later, I still think about that man and what he wanted. The silence in the woods, the way the night held its breath, and the feeling that someone had been waiting for me the whole time. But I'm glad I left when I did, and I'm grateful to have gotten out alive. Some places aren't meant for us to be alone.